In the margins of medieval manuscripts and carved into the stone facades of ancient cathedrals, strange figures stare out at modern observers with faces that should not exist where they appear. These beings have no heads upon their shoulders. Instead, their facial features are embedded directly in their chests, with eyes peering out from above the nipples and mouths gaping open where the sternum should be. They are called the Blemmyes, and for more than 2,000 years, educated people across Europe and the Mediterranean world believed they were real. Travelers claim to have seen them in the distant lands beyond the borders of civilization. Scholars wrote about them with the same certainty they applied to elephants and lions. Mapmakers placed them in the blank spaces of their charts, warning future explorers of the monstrous peoples who awaited them in unknown territories. The Blemmyes became one of the most enduring legends of the ancient and medieval world, a symbol of the strangeness that lurked at the edges of human knowledge. But like so many legends that persist across centuries, the story of the Headless people contains within it a kernel of historical truth that is far more interesting than the fantasy that grew around it. The Blemmyes were real. They were a people who lived, fought, traded, and left their mark on history. They simply were not headless. The earliest written references to headless peoples in distant lands appear in Greek sources from the 5th century before the Common Era, during a period when Greek civilization was expanding its horizons through trade, colonization, and military conquest. The historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, compiled accounts of the peoples living around the Mediterranean and beyond, drawing on the reports of traders, soldiers, and travelers who had ventured into lands unknown to most Greeks. In his histories, Herodotus mentions various fantastic peoples said to inhabit the edges of the known world, including the Akephaloi, a Greek term meaning headless ones. He places these beings in the western regions of Libya, the Greek name for Africa beyond Egypt, describing them as one of many strange races said to dwell in the unexplored interior of the continent. Herodotus himself expresses some skepticism about the more fantastic claims he records, noting that he reports what he has been told without necessarily vouching for its accuracy. This careful distinction between personal observation and hearsay would be lost by many later writers who treated his accounts as established fact. The Roman natural historian Pliny the Elder, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, compiled an encyclopedic work called The Natural History that attempted to catalogue all human knowledge about the natural world. Pliny drew heavily on Greek sources, including Herodotus, and added material from Roman travelers, soldiers, and administrators who had experience in distant provinces of the expanding empire. In his discussion of the peoples of Africa and Asia, Pliny describes the Blemmyes as a tribe without heads, their mouths and eyes set into their chests. He places them in the region south of Egypt, in the area that would correspond to modern Sudan and Ethiopia. Pliny's work became one of the most influential texts of the ancient world, copied and recopied throughout the medieval period, and his description of the Blemmyes was repeated by countless later authors who accepted his authority without question. The headless people had entered the canon of accepted knowledge about the world, where they would remain for more than 1,000 years. But Pliny's account contains a crucial ambiguity that later readers often overlooked. The name Blemmyes was not invented by Roman imagination. It referred to an actual people who lived in the desert regions between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, in the area of Upper Egypt and Nubia. These historical Blemmyes were a nomadic pastoral people who raised cattle and camels, traded with the settled populations along the Nile, and occasionally raided the prosperous towns of Roman Egypt. They spoke a language related to the Cushitic family of northeastern Africa and left behind inscriptions, graffiti, and archaeological remains that scholars have studied extensively. The real Blemmyes were a significant political and military force in the region for several centuries, sometimes allied with Rome and sometimes in conflict with it. They were not headless. They were not monstrous. They were simply a foreign people whose customs and appearance seemed strange to Greek and Roman observers accustomed to Mediterranean norms. The transformation of the real Blemmyes into the legendary headless people likely occurred through a complex process of cultural misunderstanding, exaggeration, and deliberate fiction that is common in accounts of distant peoples throughout history. Ancient travelers and traders who encountered the Blemmyes in the deserts of northeastern Africa would have found them genuinely unfamiliar in appearance and behavior. The Blemmyes may have worn distinctive clothing or body decorations that obscured or de-emphasized the head, leading to confused reports among those who saw them briefly or heard about them secondhand. Some scholars have suggested that the Blemmyes wore large circular shields that they held at shoulder height during combat, creating the visual impression from a distance that their faces were on their chests. Others propose that certain hairstyles, headdresses, or ritual practices may have contributed to the legend. The exact mechanism of the transformation remains uncertain, but the general pattern is clear. A real people with unfamiliar customs was gradually transformed through retelling into a monstrous race that bore little resemblance to the original. The tendency to describe foreign peoples as monstrous or inhuman was widespread in ancient literature and served multiple cultural functions that had little to do with accurate ethnography. By depicting the peoples beyond the borders of civilization as physically abnormal, ancient writers reinforced the superiority of their own cultures and justified the expansion of their empires into foreign territories. If the inhabitants of distant lands were headless monsters or dog-faced savages, then conquering and civilizing them could be presented as a moral duty rather than mere aggression. The Blemmyes and other monstrous races served as symbols of the chaos and disorder that existed beyond the boundaries of the civilized world, contrasting with the order and rationality that Greek and Roman writers attributed to their own societies. This symbolic function helps explain why legends of monstrous peoples persisted even when travelers returned with accurate reports that contradicted them. The legends served cultural needs that accurate information could not satisfy. Medieval European scholars inherited the classical tradition of monstrous races and incorporated it into their own understanding of the world, often adding theological interpretations that gave the legends new significance. Christian writers faced the challenge of explaining how monstrous races like the Blemmyes fit into the biblical account of creation and human descent from Adam and Eve. Some argued that the monstrous races were descendants of Cain, cursed by God for the first murder and transformed into inhuman shapes as punishment. Others suggested that they were remnants of pre-Adamic creation or beings outside the scope of human salvation. These theological debates gave new urgency to questions about the reality and nature of the monstrous races, ensuring that they remain topics of serious scholarly discussion throughout the medieval period. The Blemmyes appeared in encyclopedias, travel narratives, and world maps, always placed at the edges of the known world where European observers had not yet ventured to verify or disprove their existence. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300 in England, represents one of the most elaborate medieval world maps to survive to the present day. This magnificent work depicts the entire known world centered on Jerusalem, with Europe, Asia, and Africa arranged around the Holy City in a design that reflects theological priorities as much as geographical accuracy. Scattered across the map, particularly in the distant regions of Africa and Asia, are images of monstrous races including the Blemmyes, depicted as muscular humanoid figures with their faces embedded in their chests. The map places these beings in real geographical locations alongside accurate representations of cities, rivers, and kingdoms, treating them as facts of the same order as the location of Rome or the course of the Nile. For medieval viewers, the Blemmyes were not mere legends or artistic fantasies. They were part of the actual world, waiting to be encountered by travelers bold enough to venture beyond the familiar territories of Christendom. The persistence of the Blemmyes legend into the age of exploration created curious situations when European travelers began to penetrate the regions where the headless people were supposed to live. Portuguese, Spanish, and later Dutch and English explorers carried expectations shaped by classical and medieval accounts, and they interpreted what they saw through the lens of these preconceptions. Some travelers claim to have confirmed the existence of headless peoples, perhaps misinterpreting unfamiliar body decorations, unusual clothing, or simply telling audiences what they expected to hear. Others reported that they had searched for the Blemmyes without success, raising questions about the reliability of ancient authorities. The English explorer Sir Walter Raleigh, in his 1596 account of his voyage to South America, reported that he had heard reliable accounts of headless people called the Yuipanoma living in the interior of Guyana. Raleigh did not claim to have seen these beings himself, but he treated the reports with apparent seriousness, demonstrating how deeply the legend of headless peoples had penetrated European consciousness even at the dawn of the scientific age. The decline of belief in the Blemmyes and other monstrous races was gradual rather than sudden, occurring as European exploration and colonization brought more and more of the world under direct observation. By the 17th and 18th centuries, educated Europeans had largely abandoned belief in headless peoples, recognizing them as legends rather than facts. But the Blemmyes did not disappear from culture entirely. They transitioned from beings of natural history to figures of literature and art, appearing in poems, novels, and illustrations that treated them as fanciful creations rather than real inhabitants of distant lands. Shakespeare references the anthropophagi in men whose heads do grow beneath their shoulders in Othello, drawing on the classical tradition to evoke the exotic and dangerous world beyond European experience. The Blemmyes had completed their transformation from ethnographic error to literary trope, a journey that reveals much about how human cultures create and process information about the unknown. While the legendary Blemmyes faded from serious scientific consideration, the historical Blemmyes continued to attract scholarly attention as researchers pieced together the story of this genuine ancient people from archaeological and textual evidence. The real Blemmyes first appear clearly in historical sources during the 3rd century of the Common Era, when Roman writers begin to describe them as a threat to the security of Upper Egypt. The Romans had incorporated Egypt into their empire following the defeat of Cleopatra and Mark Antony in 30 BCE, and they devoted considerable resources to defending the province against threats from the desert peoples to the south and east. The Blemmyes were among the most formidable of these peoples, launching raids against Roman settlements, disrupting trade routes, and occasionally allying with other enemies of Rome to challenge imperial control of the region. The geographical homeland of the Blemmyes lay in the eastern desert between the Nile Valley and the Red Sea, an arid region of rocky mountains and sandy plains that offered little attraction to settled farmers but supported a pastoral way of life based on the herding of cattle, goats, and camels. From this base, the Blemmyes could strike at the prosperous towns of the Nile Valley, retreating into the desert where Roman armies found it difficult to pursue them. They also controlled important trade routes connecting the Nile to the Red Sea ports, through which valuable goods from India, Arabia, and East Africa flowed into the Mediterranean world. This strategic position gave the Blemmyes economic and political significance that far exceeded their relatively small population, and Roman authorities alternated between military campaigns to subdue them and diplomatic efforts to secure their cooperation. Archaeological excavations in the eastern desert have revealed remains of Blemmy settlements, including houses, tombs, temples, and inscriptions that provide direct evidence of their culture and beliefs. The Blemmyes appear to have worshipped a combination of traditional African deities and gods borrowed from Egyptian religion, including Isis and Mangelus, whose temples at Philae and Calabsha attracted Blemmy worshippers even after the official Christianization of the Roman Empire. The persistence of pagan worship at these sites became a source of tension between the Blemmyes and the increasingly Christian Roman administration, and the eventual closure of the temples in the 6th century marked the end of organized pagan practice in the region. The Blemmyes themselves gradually converted to Christianity in the following centuries, their descendants absorbed into the broader populations of Nubia and Upper Egypt, their name surviving only in historical texts and the distorted legends that had grown around them. The linguistic heritage of the Blemmyes offers further insights into their origins and connections. Scholars believe that the Blemmyes spoke a language belonging to the Cushitic branch of the Afroasiatic family, related to modern languages such as Beja spoken by nomadic peoples in the same region today. Some researchers have argued that the modern Beja are direct descendants of the ancient Blemmyes, preserving cultural and linguistic continuities across more than a millennium and a half. If this identification is correct, it means that the Blemmyes did not disappear from history but rather continued to exist under different names, their identity obscured by the changing terminology of successive generations of outside observers. The people once described as headless monsters are still living in the deserts of northeastern Africa, raising their animals, maintaining their traditions, and completely unaware of the strange legends that their ancestors inspired among the scholars of Greece and Rome. The transformation of the Blemmyes from a real people into a legendary race of monsters illustrates broader patterns in how human societies construct knowledge about the unfamiliar. When confronted with peoples whose appearance, language, and customs differ significantly from their own, observers throughout history have shown a tendency to exaggerate these differences, transforming cultural variation into physical monstrosity. The headlessness attributed to the Blemmyes was an extreme expression of this tendency, a way of saying that these people were so different from us that they could not really be human at all. This dehumanization served to justify exploitation and conquest, but it also reflected genuine cognitive processes through which humans categorize and make sense of the world. Understanding these processes is essential for interpreting ancient and medieval accounts of foreign peoples, recognizing the mixture of observation, interpretation, and imagination that went into their creation. The visual representation of the Blemmyes in medieval art provides additional evidence of how the legend functioned within European culture. Manuscript illuminations and church sculptures depicting headless figures served multiple purposes beyond simple illustration of geographical texts. They reminded viewers of the strangeness and danger of the world beyond Christendom, reinforcing the importance of faith and the protection of the Church. They demonstrated the creativity and skill of artists who could bring such fantastic beings to life in visual form. And they provided entertainment and wonder for audiences accustomed to narratives populated by marvels and monsters. The Blemmyes in these images are typically shown as powerful, muscular figures, their chests dominated by large eyes and gaping mouths, their postures aggressive or threatening. These are not sympathetic portraits of a misunderstood people. They are images of the other in its most extreme form, designed to provoke fascination and fear in equal measure. The scholarly tradition of monstrous races, including the Blemmyes, eventually became a subject of study in its own right, as historians and anthropologists sought to understand why such beliefs persisted for so long and what they reveal about the cultures that produced them. The pioneering work of Rudolf Virchow in the mid-20th century established the study of monstrous races as a legitimate field of academic inquiry, tracing the transmission of these legends from antiquity through the Renaissance and analyzing their cultural functions and meanings. Subsequent scholars have built on Virchow's foundations, exploring the monstrous races from perspectives including art history, literary criticism, postcolonial theory, and the history of science. The Blemmyes have been particularly important in these studies because of the unusual circumstance that a real historical people can be identified behind the legend, allowing scholars to trace the process of mythologization with unusual precision. The case of the Blemmyes also raises important questions about the reliability of ancient sources and the methods by which historians evaluate them. Herodotus and Pliny the Elder were serious scholars by the standards of their time, collecting and organizing information about the world with methods that were innovative and influential. Yet their works contain material that modern readers recognize as fantastic and impossible, mixed indiscriminately with accurate observations and useful information. Learning to distinguish between these different types of content is one of the fundamental skills of historical scholarship, requiring close attention to sources, contexts, and the interests and limitations of ancient authors. The Blemmyes legend demonstrates both the credulity of ancient scholars regarding distant peoples and the persistence of classical authority in shaping later beliefs. Medieval writers accepted the reality of headless peoples in part because Pliny had described them, and questioning Pliny meant questioning the entire structure of received knowledge about the natural world. The gradual recognition that the Blemmyes were a real people rather than a monstrous race represents a small but significant victory for empirical observation over textual authority. As European travelers and scholars accumulated direct experience of the regions where monstrous races were supposed to live, they were forced to confront the gap between classical descriptions and observed reality. This confrontation did not occur all at once, and many observers found ways to reconcile new information with old beliefs, but over time the weight of evidence became impossible to ignore. The Blemmyes were not headless because no headless humans exist anywhere on Earth. The question was not whether the classical accounts were accurate but rather how they had come to describe a real people in such fantastical terms. This shift from accepting classical authority to questioning and explaining it marked an important transition in European intellectual history, one aspect of the broader movement toward empirical science that would transform human understanding of the world. Modern anthropology has provided frameworks for understanding the cultural dynamics that produce legends like the Blemmyes, analyzing how societies construct images of the other and what functions these images serve. The concept of ethnocentrism, the tendency to view one's own culture as the norm against which all others are measured, helps explain why ancient observers so often described foreign peoples as deficient or monstrous. The Blemmyes lacked heads in the same sense that they lacked civilization, the physical absence symbolizing the cultural absence that made them seem less than fully human. This symbolic logic also helps explain why the legend persisted despite its obvious impossibility. The headlessness of the Blemmyes was never really about anatomy. It was about the perceived gap between Greek or Roman civilization and the peoples beyond its borders, a gap so vast that it could only be expressed through the language of physical monstrosity. The story of the Blemmyes thus offers a case study in the creation and persistence of cultural myths, revealing processes that remain relevant to understanding how modern societies construct images of unfamiliar peoples. The tendency to exaggerate differences, to interpret unfamiliar customs as signs of inferiority or inhumanity, and to prefer dramatic narratives over accurate observations did not disappear with the end of the medieval period. Modern forms of prejudice and stereotyping often follow similar patterns, transforming cultural differences into essential characteristics and using these constructed differences to justify unequal treatment. Studying the Blemmyes legend is not merely an exercise in antiquarian curiosity. It is an opportunity to reflect on the cognitive and cultural processes that continue to shape human perceptions of the other in the present day. The real Blemmyes, the pastoral nomads who herded their animals through the deserts of northeastern Africa, left behind only scattered traces that archaeologists and historians have worked to reconstruct. Their inscriptions, their temples, their settlements, and the accounts written about them by their Greek and Roman neighbors provide glimpses of a culture that flourished for centuries before disappearing into the larger populations of the region. They were not headless monsters but human beings living their lives according to the patterns of their culture, raising families, worshipping their gods, and defending their territories against encroachment by powerful empires. The legend of the Headless Blemmyes tells us nothing about these real people, but it tells us a great deal about the societies that created and perpetuated the legend. It reveals the fears, fantasies, and cultural assumptions that shaped how ancient and medieval Europeans understood the world beyond their borders. The modern Beja peoples of Sudan and Egypt, who may be descendants of the ancient Blemmyes, continue to live in the same desert regions where their ancestors herded their animals 2,000 years ago. They maintain traditions of pastoral nomadism adapted to one of the harshest environments on Earth, moving with their herds in search of pasture and water according to patterns established over countless generations. They speak languages related to those of the ancient Blemmyes and preserve cultural practices that may echo those of their distant ancestors. To them, the legend of the Headless People is simply a strange story from a foreign culture, bearing no relation to the reality of their lives and history. The gap between the legend and the reality, between the monstrous Blemmyes of medieval imagination and the real people who inspired the myth, encapsulates the challenge of understanding other cultures across the distances of time and difference. Bridging that gap requires patience, humility, and the willingness to question assumptions that may seem obvious but are in fact products of particular cultural perspectives. The Blemmyes invite modern observers to consider how much of what they think they know about unfamiliar peoples is similarly distorted by distance, ignorance, and cultural bias. Every age produces its own versions of the monstrous races, images of the other that reflect the fears and fantasies of those who create them rather than the reality of those they claim to describe. Recognizing this pattern in the past can help cultivate the critical awareness necessary to recognize it in the present, distinguishing between genuine knowledge of other peoples and the projections and stereotypes that so often pass for knowledge. The Headless Blemmyes never existed, but the processes that created them are very much alive. Understanding the legend is thus not only an exercise in historical scholarship but a contribution to the ongoing project of understanding human difference with accuracy and respect. The journey from the margins of a medieval map to the pages of modern scholarship has transformed the Blemmyes from monsters to be feared into people to be understood. This transformation reflects broader changes in how human societies approach knowledge of the unfamiliar, moving from acceptance of authority to demand for evidence, from fear of difference to curiosity about it. The legend of the Headless people will continue to fascinate and disturb, a reminder of how strange and wonderful human imagination can be. But behind the legend stands a real history of real people, a history that deserves to be known and remembered alongside the myths that obscured it for so long. The Blemmyes were not a headless race. They were a people whose story became entangled with fears and fantasies not of their own making, and extracting their true history from that tangle is one of the many challenges that make the study of the past so endlessly compelling.